Howdy again everyone, and today I'm finally caving in to literally years of demands from my subscribers to test out the Yongnuo 100mm f2 lens for digital SLR cameras, full frame or APS-C. I tested Yongnuo's similar 85mm f1.8 lens a few years ago and I thought that would be enough for everybody, but the demand for this 100mm version is clearly still quite high. And that's probably because of its famously low price point. In the US it costs only $180, while in the UK it's a bit more expensive at about £200. Still, that's a massive saving over Canon's original 100mm f2 lens, which still retails at about $500, so it could really open up the world of portrait photography to just about anyone. On a full-frame camera, 100mm and f2 is a great choice for portrait and subject photography, getting you subtly compressed looking backgrounds and being physically smaller and less expensive than a 135mm f2 lens. And on an APS-C camera, of course, the image will look a lot tighter, the full-frame equivalent of about 150mm, with an equivalent depth of field of about f3.2. Using it on APS-C will really emphasize your subject. This is sold as a fully electronic lens with autofocus and camera controlled aperture, but it is well known for having one or two electronic problems, and so for clarity I'm going to start with a long list of compatibility issues that the lens presented me with during testing, and here it is. So, on my digital SLR camera, a Canon 6D, everything worked fine, except that the autofocus didn't work properly in live view mode. Adapted onto my Canon EOS M3 camera, with the official Canon adapter, it was better, the autofocus worked about 80% of the time. Adapted onto my Canon EOS R, it worked almost perfectly, with quick and accurate autofocus. It must be that camera's dual pixel autofocus system at work. My guess is that the autofocus will work this well on any Canon camera with dual pixel autofocus. The camera's eye autofocus feature worked okay too. However, with my Canon EOS R, when I was shooting in video mode, the aperture wouldn't stop down darker than f2.5, which is pretty limiting. On my Sony cameras, when mounted using Sigma's excellent MC11 adapter, neither autofocus nor the aperture mechanism worked properly at all, so the lens was kind of a brick really. However, when I switched to using a very inexpensive Comlight adapter, the aperture mechanism worked, but not the autofocus motor. Phew, what a crazy shopping list of problems. I hope you found that helpful. For what it's worth, I found that it worked great on my Canon EOS R, except in video mode, of course, and that tended to be how I shot with it. Alright, let's move on from all those problems and look at the lens's build quality. It's actually not bad, it feels pretty solid. There's some plastic in its body, but it's actually mostly made of metal, even the filter thread. It weighs 400 grams. Its main control point is that focus ring, which is a bit wobbly, but it is rubberized though and turns quite smoothly. It has a clutch mechanism, so if you're in autofocus mode, you can turn it quite safely without any problems. Switch it onto manual focus mode and, surprisingly, the focus mechanism turns the opposite way to the focus ring. I've never seen that before, and it looks a little strange. It only turns 90 degrees as well, not very precise, and in the opposite direction to Canon's own lenses, so it might take a bit of getting used to. Also, it doesn't have hard stops at either end of the scale. Now, the autofocus motor works reasonably quickly, and it lets you know about this achievement with a deep, whirring, buzzing noise. That will, of course, be extremely noticeable when shooting video. When I tested it on a camera where the autofocus motor actually achieved focus, it did work quite accurately though. The lens comes with front and rear lens caps, and its filter thread size is 58mm in diameter. My copy did not come with a lens hood. Overall, this lens's electronics will only properly work depending on what particular camera you're using, but at least the build quality is solid enough. Alright now, image quality. I'm going to test it for you on a few different cameras, and you can keep track or skip ahead by seeing what they are at the top left of the screen. Let's start off with my Canon EOS R with its 30 megapixel full frame sensor. At f2, sharpness is pretty good in the middle and contrast is just okay. The corners are noticeably soft though. Stop down to f2.8 for a bit more contrast there, and f4 for a tiny bit more sharpness, and pretty good sharpness at f5.6 and f8. Stop down to f16 and the image begins to soften again due to diffraction, so it's just an average performance here. Now let's push things harder and move on to a 42 megapixel full frame camera. I've adapted it here onto my Sony a7R II. At f2, the middle of the image looks surprisingly sharp, with just a tiny hint of purple fringing on contrasting edges. The corners are really pretty soft though. As before, stop down to f2.8 for more contrast in those corners, and increasing sharpness from f4 down to f5.6, f8 and f11. And at f16, diffraction is beginning to soften the image. So again, the lens is capable of good sharpness in the middle, but its corners are soft until about f8. Finally, an APS-C camera, my 24 megapixel Sony a5100 with that smaller sensor. At f2, we see good sharpness in the middle, but the high pixel density of the APS-C sensor reveals slightly stronger purple fringing. The corners look terrible here, a colourful blurry mess. At f2.8 they're a little clearer and better again at f4, not bad at f5.6 and sharp at f8 and f11, although colour fringing is, again, more noticeable. So on an APS-C camera, if you want sharp results, you'll need to make sure your subject is in the middle of your image at all but the darkest apertures. Okay then, let's look at vignetting and distortion on a full frame camera. What jumps out first is some moderately strong pincushion distortion. At least that will make your subjects look a bit thinner though. With the aperture wide open at f2, we can also see some pretty clear vignetting, darkness in the corners. At f2.8 it's reduced, and at f4, gone. By the way, if you're shooting on a Canon camera, you might want to make sure you've turned off in-camera corrections. This picture was taken with my Canon EOS R with the corrections turned on. Weird. Now let's see about close-up image quality. This lens can focus down to about 85 centimeters, so not very close for smaller subjects, but not bad either. Here are some close-up test pictures on my 42 megapixel Sony a7R II. As you can see, sharpness in the middle is still quite strong at f2, although its purple fringing is a bit more pronounced. You only need to stop down to f2.8 though to be treated to very nice close-up image quality. How well does this lens work against bright light? Not very. In fact, there are some pretty serious problems here. I'll just let the video footage do the talking. And finally, bokeh. I'm happy to say that I found this lens's out of focus backgrounds to look pleasingly smooth in all but the trickiest of situations. No real problems here, and for some people, that's one of the most important things of all. Well then, overall, testing out the Yongnuo 100mm f2 lens was a surprise a minute with all the crazy compatibility issues it kept throwing in front of me. But on cameras that it was happy to cooperate with, I was happy to live with its results, considering its low price. If you're not bothered about corner sharpness, then it will happily get you some nice, striking images, even at wide apertures, which will look pretty good if you don't print them out too big. Its colours are fine, its contrast, well, nothing to write home about, although you can boost those in editing, of course. Personally, I'd prefer to go for Yongnuo's 85mm f1.8 lens instead. It's a slightly easier lens to use, and its compatibility issues aren't quite so bad. But for those who prefer that tighter 100mm perspective, then this lens can also get you some really nice bokeh for a reasonable price.